Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October, jarring Ben Carver from the first decent sleep he'd managed in weeks. His hand fumbled across the nightstand, knocking over a half-empty glass of water before finding his phone. The screen's harsh glow showed a number he recognized instantly. Mia's cell. "Sweetheart?" His voice carried the rough edge of interrupted sleep, but beneath it ran a thread of concern. Mia never called this late, especially not from the school's outdoor education trip to Isle Royale. What came through the speaker made his blood crystallize in his veins. "Dad." Her voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with a terror so profound it seemed to distort the words themselves. "Dad, please, something's wrong. Something's really wrong here. It took Marcus last night and we found..." Static consumed her voice, then returned. "This can't be real, but I saw it, and oh God, Dad, it's so hungry. I can feel how hungry it is, and..." Mia, slow down. Where are you exactly? Are you safe right now?" "The ranger station, but it's not..." Her breath hitched. "It's not safe anywhere. We tried to leave, but the boats are gone, and Sarah said she saw something in the trees. Something tall, and it moved wrong." "Dad?" "It moved all wrong, and the rangers won't listen. They think we're just scared kids. But Marcus is gone, and there's blood on the..." The line went dead. Ben sat bolt upright, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. He hit redial. Nothing. Again. Straight to voicemail. He tried the ranger station's main line. No answer. The school's emergency contact, voicemail. It was as if Isle Royale had been swallowed whole by the October darkness. His hands were shaking as he pulled up his laptop, searching for any information. Isle Royale National Park, the most remote wilderness preserve in Michigan, an island in Lake Superior accessible only by seaplane or ferry. The last ferry of the season was scheduled to run in 3 days, right before the first major winter storm was predicted to lock the island away until spring. The seaplanes would be grounded once the storm hit. He had maybe 48 hours before Mia would be completely unreachable for months. The weather forecast made his stomach turn. Winter Storm Helena was tracking across Minnesota, expected to dump 3 feet of snow across the Upper Peninsula and make Lake Superior impassable. If he didn't reach Mia before it hit, she'd be stranded on that island until April. Ben was dressed and throwing supplies into his truck within 20 minutes. As a construction foreman in Duluth, he knew how to move fast and prepare for the worst. But as he loaded emergency gear into the bed, flares, first aid kit, thermal blankets, rope, his toolbox, his mind kept circling back to the raw terror in his daughter's voice. In 16 years, he'd never heard Mia sound like that. Not when she broke her arm falling from a tree at 8. Not during her mother's funeral 3 years ago. This was different. This was primal. The drive from Duluth to Copper Harbor took 6 hours, and Ben pushed his truck to the edge of safety the entire way. Dawn was just bleeding across the horizon when he reached the tiny harbor town, the sky the color of old bruises. Lake Superior stretched before him, vast and gray and utterly indifferent, its surface beginning to churn as the first edges of the storm system moved in. The ferry operator, a weathered man named Hollis with more wrinkles than face, looked at Ben like he was insane. "You want to charter a boat to Isle Royale? Now? Do you see that sky, son? Helena's gonna make Superior a death trap in less than 24 hours. My daughter's on the island. School trip. She called me last night. Something's wrong." Hollis's expression shifted from incredulous to concerned. "The outdoor ed group? Heard they were up at Rock Harbor." He scratched his jaw. "Look, I can't in good conscience take you out there, but Tommy Redfeather's got a seaplane. He's Ojibwe. Knows those waters better than anyone. Might be willing to fly you if you can convince him." Ben found Tommy at a small hangar on the outskirts of town, performing maintenance on a de Havilland beaver that had seen better decades. The pilot was in his mid-50s, his long black hair pulled back in a ponytail, his face carved with the kind of lines that spoke of a lifetime reading the weather and the water. "Isle Royale," Tommy said flatly when Ben explained the situation. "Today, with Helena breathing down our necks." He was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying Ben with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "Your daughter's with that school group at Rock Harbor?" "Yes, please. I'll pay whatever you want." "It's not about money." Tommy set down his wrench, his expression grave. "You know the history of that island? The real history, not the tourist version?" Ben shook his head, impatient, but sensing he needed to let Tommy speak. "My people, the Ojibwe, we have stories about Isle Royale going back centuries. We used to mine copper there, sacred ground, but we stopped. Left the island alone. You know why?" Tommy didn't wait for an answer. Because something lived in the deep woods. Something that got stronger in the winter when hunger set in. The elders called it by different names, but the Algonquian peoples to the east, they called it Wendigo. The word hung in the cold morning air like a curse. "It's just a legend," Ben said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was thinking of Mia's words. It moved wrong. Legends exist for a reason, warnings, passed down. Tommy picked up a tobacco pouch, pinched some out, and scattered it on the ground. An offering. There have been disappearances on that island for as long as records exist. Park Service doesn't like to talk about it. 32 people vanished without a trace since 1900. Most during winter, or right before winter. Bodies never found. "Tommy, please, I'll take you." Tommy cut him off. "Because if your daughter called you scared, something real is happening. But we need to be smart. Fast in, fast out. I'm not getting caught on that island when Helena hits." They were airborne within the hour. The Beaver's engine roared as they climbed, Lake Superior spreading beneath them like hammered steel. Tommy kept them low, threading between the first advanced tendrils of storm clouds. Through the headset, he briefed Ben on what they were walking into. Rock Harbor's on the northeast side. Ranger station, some cabins for researchers, a few camping areas. This time of year, your daughter's group might be the only people left on the island. Park officially closes in October. He adjusted their heading. If someone from that group really is missing, the Rangers should have called for help already. Fact that they haven't is a problem. Ben stared out at the churning water below, his gut tight with dread. Mia said the Rangers wouldn't listen to them. Or couldn't. Tommy's jaw was set. Isle Royale's 45 miles long, 9 miles wide. Nothing but forest, swamps, and rocky ridges. If something's hunting in those woods, you could hide an army. The island materialized through the thickening weather, a dark spine of rock and pine rising from Superior's cold waters. Tommy brought them down in Rock Harbor with the skill of someone who'd made this approach 1,000 times, the pontoons kissing the water with barely a splash. He taxied toward a small dock where a Park Service boat was tied up, swaying in the increasing chop. The ranger station was a modest building of wood and stone, smoke rising from its chimney. But something was wrong immediately. Ben could feel it. An oppressive weight in the air, a sense of being watched from the dark tree line. The forest seemed to lean inward, and in the strange pre-storm light, the shadows beneath the pines looked deeper than they should. Tommy killed the engine, and in the sudden silence, Ben heard it. A sound like wind through trees, except there was no wind. A low, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, rising and falling in a rhythm that was almost like breathing. "We need to move fast," Tommy said quietly, his hand going to something beneath his jacket. Ben caught a glimpse of carved bone and feathers. A medicine bundle. "Stay close to me. Don't wander toward the trees, and whatever you do, don't respond if you hear someone calling your name from the forest." They tied off the plane and approached the station. The door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar. Ben pushed it open, calling out, "Hello? Park Service? My daughter's with the school group. I need to find her." The interior was dim, the only light coming from a dying fire in the stone fireplace. Maps covered the walls, and a radio sat silent on the desk, its red power light off. Papers were scattered across the floor, and there was a smell, something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in a warm place. "Dad?" Ben spun. Mia stood in the doorway to a back room, and the sight of her nearly broke him. She looked like she'd aged years in the 3 days since he'd last seen her. Her face was pale as paper, her eyes red-rimmed and too large, her auburn hair tangled. She was shaking. "Oh my God, sweetheart." He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. She felt fragile, trembling like a bird. "I'm here. I'm here. Tell me what happened." The story came out in fractured pieces. The field trip group, 12 students, 2 teachers, 1 ranger guide, had arrived 4 days ago. Standard outdoor education, ecology studies, wilderness skills, preparing for their Thanksgiving break. Everything was normal the first 2 days. Then Marcus Chen, one of the students, volunteered to collect firewood after dinner. He never came back. They searched until midnight. Found nothing. Ranger Davidson, the guide assigned to them, radioed for help. But the radio died midway through the transmission. When they tried to leave the next morning, their boat was gone from the dock. Not drifted away, gone, the lines cut clean through. That's when we heard it for the first time, Mia whispered against Ben's chest. At night, something moving in the trees, something big. It sounded like clicking, like bones rubbing together. And the smell, Dad, like death. Where are the others? Mr. Kowecki and Ms. Pryor took 6 of the students to try and reach the other side of the island, to the Wendigo Ranger Station. Ben's blood chilled at the name. They thought maybe the radio there would work. That was yesterday morning. They haven't come back. And Ranger Davidson? Mia's face crumpled. He went into the woods last night. Said he heard his wife calling him. But his wife's been dead for 2 years. He told us that the first day. He just walked into the trees. We screamed at him to stop, but he didn't even look back. Tommy had been searching the station while they talked. He emerged from the back with a ledger, his expression grim. Found Davidson's journal. You need to see this. The ranger's handwriting deteriorated from neat printed entries to wild scrawls over the course of 3 days. Oki 24, group arrived, 12 kids, 2 teachers, standard protocol. Oki T25, unusually cold for October. Wildlife scarce, haven't seen any moose, which is odd. Students doing well. Oak T26, Chen kid missing, searched until midnight, found tracks, wrong, too large, stride too long, called for help but radio failing, something wrong with the equipment, everything electronic dying. Oak 27, heard Wendy's voice last night. I know she's dead, I know, but I heard her calling from the woods. She's hungry, so hungry. Have to help her. The old stories are true. God help us, they're all true. It's awake and it's starving. The final entry was barely legible. Don't eat. Don't ever eat. That's how it spreads. The hunger never ends. There are 4 other students still here, Mia said. In the cabin next door. They're too scared to leave. Ben's mind was racing, trying to process what he was reading, what he was hearing, against what he knew to be possible. Tommy's face had gone stone-like, his hand white-knuckled around his medicine bundle. We need to gather everyone and get to the plane, Ben said. Now, before that storm hits. But Tommy was shaking his head, looking at something out the window. Too late. Ben followed his gaze. The tree line, maybe 200 yards from the station, had changed. The shadows beneath the pines were moving, coalescing into a shape that hurt to look at directly. Something impossibly tall and impossibly thin, its proportions all wrong, as if someone had taken a human skeleton and stretched it like taffy. Its skin, if it was skin, was the gray-white of freezer-burned meat, pulled tight over bones that jutted at angles that defied anatomy. The head was elongated, the jaw distended, and in the sockets where eyes should be, there was only a luminous, horrible hunger. The creature took a step forward, and that's when Ben understood what Mia meant. It didn't walk. It folded through space, each movement a violation of how bodies should move, joints bending in directions that had no names. And the sound it made, that clicking, grinding sound, It was the noise of bones scraping against bones, cartilage compressed beyond all natural limits. "Wendigo," Tommy breathed, and Ben heard genuine terror in the pilot's voice for the first time. "It's in the final transformation. Someone on this island broke the ultimate taboo. Someone ate human flesh." Mia made a small, broken sound. "Marcus, we found him this morning. What was left of him? In the abandoned mining camp up the ridge. Someone had been eating." The implication hit Ben like a physical blow. One of the missing group members hadn't just vanished. They'd crossed a line that unmade humanity itself, and in doing so, they'd become something else. Something ancient and insatiable. The Wendigo moved closer, and Ben could feel it now. The hunger. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a physical presence, a gravitational pull of need so vast and bottomless that it seemed to hollow out the air itself. His stomach cramped with sudden, impossible hunger, even though he'd eaten on the drive. Beside him, Mia whimpered, her hand going to her stomach. "Don't think about food," Tommy said urgently, pulling out his medicine bundle and beginning to lay out items. Tobacco, sage, a small knife with a bone handle. "That's how it gets into your head. The hunger is a lie. It feeds on want, and it makes you want, until there's nothing left but appetite." "How do we kill it?" Ben demanded, his hand instinctively going to the hammer in his tool belt. Useless, probably, but the weight was comforting. "You don't. Not with tools or weapons." Tommy was drawing symbols in ash from the fireplace, ancient geometric patterns. "Wendigo can only be killed by fire, and only if you burn the heart completely. Otherwise, it regenerates. But that's not our priority. We need to get off this island before it decides we're prey." A scream split the air. High, terrified, young. The cabin next door. Ben didn't think. He moved, bursting out the station door and sprinting the 30 feet to the student's cabin. Mia was right behind him, screaming for him to wait, but a father's instinct overrode all sense. He hit the cabin door with his shoulder and it splintered inward. 4 teenagers huddled in the far corner, pressed together like animals. But between them and the door, something else had found its way inside. Ranger Davidson, or what had been Davidson, crouched on all fours, his spine twisted into an arch that belonged on no human frame. His face was turned toward the students, and his mouth was open far too wide, showing teeth that had somehow multiplied, rows of them going back into a throat that seemed to have no end. The hunger poured off him in waves, and Ben understood with sick certainty that the Ranger hadn't fully transformed yet. He was still partially human, still fighting it, but losing. The Wendigo outside had been human once too, and this was the process. The slow consumption of everything that made you human, replaced with nothing but need. "Mr. Carver?" Davidson's voice was wet and wrong, words malformed by his distorted mouth. "I'm so hungry, so hungry. And they're young, tender. Please, I need..." Tommy was there suddenly, pushing past Ben with the bone knife held high. He spoke rapid words in Ojibwe, too fast for Ben to follow, and thrust the knife not at Davidson but at the floor, pinning something, a shadow maybe, or the manifestation of hunger itself. The Ranger convulsed, screaming, and in that moment, Ben grabbed the nearest student, a boy named Jason, and shoved him toward the door. "Move. All of you move now." They ran. All 6 of them, Ben, Mia, Tommy, and the 4 students, burst from the cabin and sprinted toward the dock. Behind them, Davidson's screams reached an inhuman pitch and then cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse. The Wendigo was closer now, just 50 yards from the dock, and Ben could see it in detail that would scar him forever. Its ribcage was visible through translucent skin, each rib sharp as a blade. Its arms were too long, ending in fingers that had fused into points like icicles, and its face, God. Its face was caught mid-transformation between human and something else, frozen in an expression of absolute agony and absolute hunger. Tommy reached the plane first, tearing open the door and practically throwing students inside. Get in. Ben was counting heads, making sure all 4 students were aboard, helping Mia climb up, when he heard it. A voice from the forest, clear as day, cutting through the rising wind. "Benjamin, Ben, please honey, I'm so cold. I'm so hungry, help me." His dead wife's voice. He froze, his hand on the plane's doorframe, his entire body going rigid. Sarah had been dead for 3 years. Cancer, a long and brutal fight. But that was her voice. The slight rasp she'd developed near the end. The way she said his full name when she needed him. "Ben?" Tommy grabbed his jacket. "It's not her. It's using your memories, your grief. Don't listen." But the voice came again, closer now. "I've been waiting, Ben. I've been so alone. And I'm so hungry. Don't you want to help me? Don't you love me anymore?" Mia was screaming inside the plane, screaming for him to get in, and some distant part of Ben knew she was right, knew this was the Wendigo's trick. But a larger part, the part that had held Sarah's hand as she died, that had promised to always take care of her, that part was already moving toward the voice. He took 3 steps toward the forest before Tommy tackled him, bringing them both down hard on the dock. The pilot's face was inches from his own, eyes fierce. "Your daughter needs you alive. Sarah's gone. This thing is using your love as bait." The words cut through the fog. Ben blinked, gasped, and the spell broke. He looked toward the forest and saw it now. The Wendigo standing at the tree line, its mouth moving in perfect mimicry of human speech. But there was nothing human in those sunken, glowing eyes. Only hunger. Only need. They scrambled into the plane. Tommy was in the pilot's seat, hands flying over the controls, priming the engine. It coughed, sputtered, and died. "No, no, no." Tommy tried again. The Beaver's engine turned over but wouldn't catch. "Something's wrong. The fuel line maybe, or..." The Wendigo took a step onto the dock, then another. The wood groaned under its weight, despite how emaciated it looked. Each step was accompanied by that grinding, clicking sound, bones moving in ways bones shouldn't move. Ben's mind raced. The plane was dead. The storm was coming. They were trapped on a dock with nowhere to run, and the thing approaching them was a walking nightmare of hunger given form. Think. Think like a foreman. What resources do you have? What's the problem? His eyes fell on his toolbox, still in his hands from the mad sprint, and then to the fuel can strapped to the dock for refueling boats. And then he remembered what Tommy had said. Fire. The heart must burn completely. Get everyone out, Ben said quietly. Through the water. Swim to shore and run inland. Don't stop. Dad, no. Mia, now. He looked at Tommy. Get her and those kids somewhere safe. I'll buy you time. Tommy's eyes met his, and something unspoken passed between them. The pilot nodded once, then began herding the terrified students out the back of the plane into the freezing water of Rock Harbor. Ben waited until he heard the splashing fade, until he was alone on the dock with the Wendigo closing in. It was 15 feet away now, and up close the wrongness was overwhelming. The smell alone, rotted meat and frost and something chemical like ammonia, made his eyes water. But worse was the hunger itself, radiating off the creature in psychic waves. Ben's stomach cramped so badly he nearly doubled over. His mouth watered despite his terror. He wanted to eat, needed to eat. The hunger was everything, consuming thought and will and... No. He thought of Mia. 16 years of memories, from that first moment in the delivery room when she'd gripped his finger with her tiny hand, to this morning when she'd looked at him like he was still her hero. He'd promised Sarah he'd keep their daughter safe. He'd promised. The Wendigo lunged. Ben was already moving. He wrenched open his toolbox with one hand while the other grabbed a fuel can. The creature was fast, impossibly fast. But Ben had worked construction for 25 years and his reflexes were still sharp. He hurled a wrench at the Wendigo's head, and while it batted the tool away like an annoying insect, Ben unscrewed the fuel cap and doused himself. The smell of gasoline overpowered everything. The Wendigo paused, its head tilting at an angle that would have broken a human neck, as if confused by this suicidal action. Come on then, Ben said, his voice steady despite everything. You want to feed? Let's feed the flames together. He had a lighter in his pocket, Sarah's lighter actually, the one she'd quit smoking with years ago. He'd carried it ever since she died, a talisman. He flicked it open with shaking hands. The Wendigo understood what he was about to do. It shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, like winter wind through a frozen chest cavity, and rushed forward with both claw-tipped hands extended. Ben ignited the lighter. The world became flame. The gasoline on his clothes caught with a whoosh that stole the oxygen from his lungs. But he'd poured more fuel on the dock itself, and as the Wendigo's foot came down, fire raced across the weathered wood like water. The creature stumbled, and Ben, already burning, threw himself forward in a tackle that would have made his high school football coach proud. They went down together, locked in a blazing embrace. The Wendigo's scream escalated to a pitch beyond hearing, vibrating in Ben's bones. He could smell his own flesh cooking, could feel his skin bubbling and splitting, but he held on. His arms were around the thing's torso, where the heart should be, and he squeezed with all his remaining strength, holding it in the flames. The Wendigo thrashed, its inhuman strength nearly breaking Ben's grip. But he thought of Sarah, and he thought of Mia, and he held on. The dock collapsed beneath them in a shower of sparks, plunging both into the frigid water of Rock Harbor. The cold was agony and mercy in equal measure. Steam rose in clouds as the flames were extinguished, and Ben's grip finally failed. He sank, his lungs screaming, his burned body unable to respond to his commands. The Wendigo sank too, but slower, its body less dense somehow, as if the hunger had hollowed it out. In the murky water, Ben saw the creature's chest cavity burst open, not from the burns, but from within. Something small and black and still pulsing sat where the heart should be, and as he watched through dimming vision, the flames around it consumed the organ completely. The Wendigo's body began to disintegrate, flesh falling away like ash, bones crumbling until there was nothing left but sediment drifting in the current. Ben's head broke the surface. He gasped, the air like knives in his damaged lungs. Strong hands grabbed him, Tommy somehow impossibly pulling him toward shore. The pilot was saying something, but Ben couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness claimed him was Mia's face, pale and terrified and alive, as she helped drag him onto the rocky beach. He woke to the thrumming of the seaplane's engine, and Mia's hand clasped in his own. His body was a symphony of pain, wrapped in what felt like every thermal blanket Tommy owned. They were airborne, fleeing Isle Royale as the first heavy snowflakes of Storm Helena began to fall. "Dad?" Mia's voice was small, broken. "Stay with me. Please stay with me." Ben managed to squeeze her hand. Through the plane's window, he could see the island receding below them, already being swallowed by white. Tommy had somehow gotten the Beaver's engine working, divine intervention or mechanical luck. Ben wasn't sure which, and didn't care. "The others?" Ben croaked. "All safe, all 4 students. Tommy got them to the emergency shelter on the north side of the island. Rangers are coming from the mainland once the storm passes to evacuate everyone." Mia's eyes were bright with tears. "You saved us, Dad. You saved all of us." But at what cost? Ben could feel it. The damage to his body was catastrophic. 3rd-degree burns over 60% of his surface area. Smoke inhalation. Hypothermia. He might not survive the flight to Copper Harbor, let alone the helicopter medevac to Duluth's burn unit. Tommy's voice came through headphones that someone, Mia probably, had placed on Ben's head. "There's something you should know. About the Wendigo. About what happened." "The teacher?" Ben managed. "Ms. Pryor. We found evidence in her cabin. She'd been reading about the island's history, the Native American legends, and she'd been losing weight rapidly. Eating disorder, one of the students said. When the group got stranded, when food ran short and Marcus disappeared." Tommy paused. "She found his body. And she made a choice. The worst choice." Mia's hand tightened on Ben's. "Mr. Kowecki and the other students are probably dead. The transformation, once it starts, you can't stop it." You can only delay it. Ms. Pryor became that thing we saw, and the hunger spread to Ranger Davidson just from being near her. A cautionary tale, Tommy said quietly. The Wendigo isn't just a monster, it's a reminder of what we can become when we let hunger, any kind of hunger, consume us completely, when we prioritize want over humanity. Ben closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him. He'd survived. His daughter had survived. But 4 people were dead, maybe more, and Isle Royale would keep its secrets, buried under winter snow, waiting for spring and the next group of unsuspecting visitors. "Dad?" Mia's voice pulled him back from the edge of sleep, or something deeper. "Don't leave me, please, I can't lose you too." He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw Sarah in her eyes. The same determination, the same love. And he made a choice. Not the easy path toward rest and peace, but the harder one. To stay, to fight, to survive. Not leaving, he whispered. Promise. The beaver cut through the storm, carrying them toward the mainland and whatever came next. Behind them, Isle Royale disappeared into the white fury of winter, its forests and ridges and ancient secrets locked away until the thaw. And in those deep woods, in places where human feet rarely trod, other things waited. Other hungers, other warnings left unheeded. But for now, in this moment, suspended between earth and sky, Ben Carver held his daughter's hand and chose life. Even in the face of impossible horror, even with his body broken and his world forever changed, he chose to remain. Because that's what fathers do. That's what love demands. The Wendigo was dead. But the hunger that lived in all humans, the capacity for desperation and darkness, that would never truly die. It would only sleep, waiting for the next winter, the next moment of weakness, the next soul desperate enough to cross the line between survival and monstrosity. As they descended toward Copper Harbor through the snow, Tommy spoke one final time, reciting words in Ojibwe that Ben didn't understand but felt in his bones. A prayer, maybe, or a warning, a reminder that some prices are too high to pay, no matter how deep the hunger goes. And in the back of the plane, wrapped in blankets and pain and love, Benjamin Carver held on. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? The radio crackled with static at 6:47 a.m., 18 hours into the search. Christopher Anderson stood at the edge of Lauren Mitchell's abandoned campsite, watching his breath condensate in the cold morning air. The Hoh rainforest pressed in from all sides, ancient Sitka spruce draped in moss like funeral shrouds, the ground a carpet of ferns that muffled every sound until the world felt wrapped in wet cotton. Base, this is Anderson. I'm at the site. Tents intact, backpacks here, sleeping bags still warm to the touch. Chris paused, his gloved hand hovering over Lauren's belongings. A half-eaten protein bar sat on a flat stone beside her camping stove. The fuel canister was still attached, valve open, hissing quietly into the dawn. She left in a hurry, maybe 2-3 hours ago. Copy that, Chris. Sarah Chen's voice came through thin and distant. Storm front's moving faster than predicted. You've got maybe 4 hours before it hits. Find her and get out. Chris clicked off without responding. 4 hours. In 5 years of working Olympic National Park, he'd learned that timelines meant nothing once the forest decided to keep someone. He'd learned other things too, things that kept him up at night, things that made him request a transfer 3 times before finally accepting that running didn't help. The Hoh didn't let go of what it wanted. He knelt beside the tent, cataloging details with the methodical precision that had kept him alive this long. Lauren Mitchell, 28, experienced backpacker from Portland. She'd registered at the ranger station 3 days ago, with a smile that suggested she'd done this route a dozen times. Solo hiker. No emergency contacts listed except an ex-boyfriend in Seattle who hadn't heard from her in 6 months. Nobody would miss her immediately. Chris recognized that pattern. The trees around the campsite were standard old growth, Douglas fir, western hemlock, red cedar trunks wider than his truck. But something felt wrong about their arrangement. He'd been to this site before, back in 2009, and he could have sworn the clearing had been larger. Now the trees seemed closer, leaning inward like spectators at an accident. Chris stood, adjusting the weight of his pack. 72 pounds of emergency gear, first aid, rope, flares, GPS unit, two-way radio, extra batteries. The Garmin on his wrist showed his position clearly. Latitude 47.8607, longitude 123.9352, elevation 578 feet. He was 2.3 miles from the Ho River Trail, deep enough that cell service had died yesterday afternoon. He found her first tracks heading northeast, away from the trail system, toward the deeper forest where the map showed nothing but green and the word unmaintained in careful cartographic script. The tracks were erratic. She'd been running. Chris followed, his headlamp cutting through the pre-dawn gray. The forest floor here was a treacherous maze of exposed roots and rotting logs slick with moss. Ferns brushed against his legs, leaving cold water trails on his uniform pants. The air smelled like decay and growth happening simultaneously. That peculiar Pacific Northwest scent of things living on top of things dying. 20 minutes in, he found her first piece of gear. A fleece jacket, North Face, bright purple against the monotone greens and browns. It was draped over a fallen log almost deliberately, sleeves spread like someone had laid it out to dry. Chris picked it up, still damp from yesterday's rain, but not soaked through. She'd been wearing it recently. He checked the pockets, empty except for a crumpled receipt from a gas station in Forks dated 2 days ago. Nothing else. No note, no signs of struggle, no blood. He keyed his radio. Found her jacket, still heading northeast. She's moving toward Mineral Creek Basin. That's off trail, Chris, way off trail. I know. The maps show. I know what the maps show, Sarah. Static filled the silence between them. Then, how are you holding up? Chris didn't answer. He shoved the jacket into his pack and kept moving, following footprints that seemed to grow more confident the farther they went from the trail, as if Lauren had stopped fleeing and started pursuing something. The forest changed as he descended. The canopy thickened, strangling the dawn light before it could reach the ground. Temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. His breath came out in thick clouds now, and frost clung to the moss despite it being October. Despite this being a temperate rainforest where freezing temperatures were rare this early in the season. At 7:32 a.m., Chris heard the first voice. Help. He froze mid-step, right boot planted on a rotted log that groaned under his weight. The voice had come from ahead, maybe 50 yards, filtered through the trees like it had traveled underwater. Lauren? He called out, hand instinctively moving to the canister of bear spray on his belt. Lauren Mitchell, this is Park Ranger Christopher Anderson. Call out again so I can locate you. Silence, then fainter. Help me, please. Female voice. Could be Lauren. Could be. But something about the acoustics felt wrong. Too clear, too direct, like the words had been placed in his ear rather than spoken across distance. Chris moved forward with his hand on the spray. He'd carried a sidearm during his first 3 years as a ranger, back before the incident at North Cascades. Back before they'd found Marcus's body, what was left of it, in a ravine that Marcus had mapped correctly, had radioed about clearly, had described with perfect accuracy 30 minutes before he'd started screaming things that didn't make sense. Things about voices, about the trees moving, about something that sounded like his daughter calling him deeper. Marcus had been Chris's partner. Marcus hadn't had a daughter. Keep talking, Lauren, I'm coming to you. Chris pushed through a dense patch of salal, branches scraping against his jacket. The understory here was thick enough to force him into a half-crouch, and the lack of sight lines made his skin prickle. Are you injured? Can you walk? Cold. The voice drifted from a different direction now. West, maybe, or southwest. So cold, Chris. Why is it so cold? Chris stopped. She'd used his name. How would she know his name? He keyed the radio. Sarah, did Lauren Mitchell have any contact with Rangers when she registered? Did she talk to anyone specifically? Stand by. Papers rustling in the background. Looks like, yeah, Tom Brightwell checked her in. Why? She know my name? What? Did she specifically ask about me or mention me? Chris, what's going on? He clicked off and stood still, listening. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. Even the ever-present drip of condensation from the moss seemed to have paused. In a rainforest that averaged 140 inches of precipitation annually, silence was impossible. Chris? The voice again, coming from directly ahead now. Chris, I can see you. I've been waiting. He moved forward slowly, pushing through the undergrowth until he broke into a small clearing dominated by a massive western red cedar. The tree was easily 800 years old, its base hollowed by fire but still living, still growing. The hollow was large enough to stand in, and in the pre-dawn gloom it looked like a mouth. Lauren Mitchell sat with her back against the cedar, still in her hiking clothes, head tilted at an angle that made Chris's training kick in immediately. Possible neck injury. Hypothermia likely given the temperature. She was barefoot. Her boots sat neatly beside her, laces still tied. Lauren? Chris approached carefully, already pulling emergency blanket from his pack. Lauren, I'm Ranger Anderson. Can you hear me? Can you tell me if you're injured? She didn't respond, didn't move. Her eyes were open, staring at something above and behind Chris's head. He knelt beside her, fingers finding her wrist to check for pulse. Her skin was ice cold, colder than the air. Cold enough that his fingers recoiled instinctively before training forced them back. Faint pulse. She was alive. Lauren, I need you to respond. Can you squeeze my hand? He wrapped the thermal blanket around her shoulders, already reaching for his radio. Stay with me. I'm getting you out of here. Her head turned slowly, mechanically, until she was looking directly at him. Her pupils were fully dilated black, consuming the iris. When she spoke, her lips barely moved. He's been waiting for you, Chris. He knew you'd come back. Then she smiled. It wasn't her smile. Chris knew that with the same certainty he'd known that Marcus's voice hadn't really been coming from the ravine, that the thing screaming his partner's last words hadn't been his partner at all. Who's waiting? Chris kept his voice steady, professional, even as every instinct screamed at him to run. Lauren, who are you talking about? You know. Her smile widened. You never really left. Part of you stayed here. Part of you has always been here in the green and the dark. He tastes it on you. He tastes Marcus. Chris jerked back, hand moving to his radio. Base, this is Anderson. I found her. I need immediate medical evac. Lauren's hand shot out, faster than someone with her core temperature should have been able to move, and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was impossibly strong. No reception here, no signals, nothing gets in, nothing gets out. Just like before. Just like Marcus. Just like all the others. She pulled him closer, and Chris could see now that her eyes weren't just dilated, they were reflecting something. Movement. Shadow. Things writhing behind the surface like parasites under skin. He showed me everything, Chris. All the bones, all the voices. They're still here. They never left. They're all still calling. Her grip tightened until Chris felt bones grinding. Your voice is so much louder than the others. He's been hungry for it. Hungry for 5 years. Chris yanked his arm back with enough force to make her grip slip. He stumbled backward, catching himself against a tree. When he looked at Lauren again, she'd gone completely still, head lolling forward, the thermal blanket sliding off her shoulders. Lauren? No response. But from the hollow of the cedar tree behind her, Chris heard something else. A rustling. Movement. The sound of wet things sliding against wood. If this story is gripping you, follow for more quality horror. What would you do in Chris's situation? Share below. He ran. Training said stay with the victim. Protocol said establish baseline vitals, maintain warmth, call for backup. But every cell in Chris's body was screaming the same message it had screamed 5 years ago, when he'd heard Marcus's voice coming from impossible directions. Run, 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 run. He crashed through the underbrush, no longer following any trail, just moving away. His GPS showed him heading south, back toward the main trail system, but the trees all looked the same now. Every direction was moss and shadow, and the feeling of being watched by something patient and hungry. Behind him, he heard Lauren's voice. Chris. Chris, wait. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. Chris, please don't leave me. It sounded exactly like her. Scared, confused, human. He didn't stop. Chris, I'm so cold I can't feel my legs. Chris, please, I don't want to die out here alone. The words wrapped around his spine like fingers. He could see the headline already. Ranger abandons dying hiker. The review board. The investigation. Another career ending in disgrace and nightmares. But he remembered Marcus's autopsy. The coroner had found bark under his fingernails. Cedar bark. From trees that didn't grow anywhere near where they'd found the body. The coroner had found moss in his lungs. Not inhaled. Grown. Small strands of moss rooted in lung tissue. Growing. Chris kept running. The forest opened into a narrow valley following a creek bed. Chris recognized it from the maps. Mineral Creek, flowing west toward the Hoh River. If he followed it downstream, he'd hit the maintained trail in less than a mile. He splashed into the water, ice cold and shin deep, and started wading. The current tugged at his boots but gave him direction. Something solid and real. Why are you running, Chris? The voice came from ahead now. Impossible. Lauren couldn't have gotten ahead of him. You know you can't leave. You know what happens when you try to leave. He pushed forward, water soaking through his uniform pants. The creek curved around a massive root ball where a centuries-old Sitka spruce had fallen, creating a natural dam. Chris climbed over it, hands gripping wood that felt wrong. Too soft, too yielding, like flesh pretending to be tree. On the other side, Lauren stood in the middle of the creek. She was completely naked now, skin pale as the belly of a fish. Water flowed around her legs, but she didn't shiver, didn't react to the cold. Moss grew in her hair, hanging in wet strands that dripped green water down her shoulders. Her eyes were still black, still reflecting things that moved in dimensions Chris's brain refused to process. He wants to show you something, she said. He wants you to understand what Marcus understood, what I understand now. You're not Lauren. Chris's hand found the bear spray on his belt. Useless against this, against whatever this was, but it was something. Where is she? What did you do with her? I am Lauren. I'm all of them. I'm the lost ones. I'm the voices in the green. I'm what waits in the spaces between the trees. She took a step forward, water not even rippling around her legs. He collects us. He wears us. We're his language. We're how he speaks to the living. What is he? Old. She smiled, and her teeth were stained green. Older than the trees. Older than the glacier that carved this valley. He's been feeding here since before humans gave names to things. Feeding on the lost. The alone. The ones no one will miss. Chris backed up, boots slipping on wet stone. I radioed in. They know where I am. They'll come looking. Will they? Lauren tilted her head. Or will they hear your voice on the radio, calm and clear, saying you found nothing? That you're heading back? That the search should be called off? The radio on his belt crackled. His own voice came through, distant but clear. Base, this is Anderson. False alarm on the jacket. Probably left here last season. No sign of the hiker. I'm RTB. Copy, Chris. Sarah's voice tinny and small. Sorry it was a dead end. Storm's moving in fast. Get back safe. Chris stared at the radio. He hadn't transmitted. He hadn't said those words. But he could hear himself saying them. Could hear Sarah accepting them. Could hear the search being called off. You see? Lauren took another step closer. He can taste your voice. He's been digesting it for 5 years. Ever since Marcus. Ever since you fled and left part of yourself behind in the green. He's had time to learn you. To practice you. This isn't real. Chris was still backing up, almost at the creek bank now. This is hypothermia. Dehydration. I'm hallucinating. Are you? She gestured around them. Look at the trees, Chris. Really look. He didn't want to, but his eyes betrayed him, tracking to the forest around the creek. The trees were closer. They were definitely closer. And they weren't just trees anymore. The patterns in the bark looked like faces. Hundreds of them, thousands. Mouths open in silent screams, eyes hollow and pleading. Some of the faces were recent enough that Chris recognized them from missing persons posters. Others were so weathered they'd become part of the grain itself, absorbed completely. One face was Marcus. His partner's features were there in the bark of a western hemlock, mouth open, eyes wide. The wood had grown around the expression, preserving it like a photograph. He takes everything, Lauren said softly. Voice, identity, memory. He wears them like clothes, calls out in them, lures more of us in. You've been hearing him for years, haven't you? In quiet moments, in the space between sleep and waking, Marcus's voice, other voices, calling you back. Chris had. God help him, he had. Late at night in his apartment in Port Angeles, he'd heard Marcus's voice on the wind, calling his name, asking why he'd left him, why he'd run. The guilt brings them back, Lauren continued. The survivors, the ones who got away, they can't resist. They have to know. They have to understand. And when they come back, he's waiting, ready to add them to his collection. What does he want? Want? Lauren laughed, and it echoed wrong in the valley, repeating from trees that had mouths now that were opening and closing in rhythm with her laughter. He doesn't want, he is. Like the forest is. Like the rain is. He feeds. He grows. He collects. That's not want. That's nature. Chris's back hit solid ground. He'd reached the creek bank. 20 yards behind him was dense undergrowth leading upslope. If he could get to higher ground, follow the ridge line, he might... There's nowhere to go, Lauren said. You're already inside him. You've been inside him since you entered the forest. These trees are his body. This moss is his skin. That water you're standing in is his blood. Olympic National Park is just a name humans gave him. A way to pretend they understand. To pretend they have control. She was close enough now that Chris could see the moss wasn't just in her hair. It was growing from her scalp, roots burrowing into skin, close enough to see that her chest wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. Lauren Mitchell died 3 days ago, she said, answering his unspoken realization. Heart attack on the trail, quick, painless. He was gentle with her, but her body is still useful. Her voice still works. And you recognize her voice, don't you, Chris? You read her file. You saw her photo, you felt responsible. That's the hook, that's always the hook. Chris pulled the bear spray, aimed it directly at her face. Get back. That won't help, but try if it makes you feel better. He likes the ones who fight, the ones who struggle. It makes the voice richer when he finally takes it. More layers, more depth. He pressed the trigger. The spray shot out in an orange stream, coating Lauren's face and chest. She didn't flinch, didn't close her eyes. The capsaicin ran down her skin like water pooling in the moss, doing nothing. See? She wiped at her face casually, and her hand came away covered in flesh that sloughed off like wet paper. Underneath wasn't muscle and bone. It was green, living wood, moss, fungus. A body made of forest, wearing human skin like a costume. He's been growing new Laurens, new voices. It takes time, but he has so much time. Centuries, millennia. What's a few days to him? The thing wearing Lauren's face opened its mouth wider than a human mouth should open, and Chris saw teeth made of stone, a tongue made of vines, a throat that went down and down and down into depths that couldn't possibly fit in a body that size. He wants you to understand before he takes you, it said, and the voice was changing now, becoming multiple voices layered over each other. Lauren's voice, Marcus's voice, dozens of others. He wants you to know that you never left, that you've been his since the moment you came here, that this guilt, this need to understand, this compulsion to search, it's not yours. It's his. He planted it in you. He's been growing it, feeding it, and now it's ripe. Chris turned and ran. No plan, no direction, just pure animal panic. He crashed through ferns and salal, ripping through spider webs that felt like wire, climbing over logs that seemed to shift under his weight. The forest was a labyrinth now. Every direction identical, every tree the same. His GPS showed his position jumping erratically, one moment at elevation 600, the next at 1200, the next reading no signal, despite having clear sky above through gaps in the canopy. Voices called from every direction. His mother's voice, dead 10 years, asking him to come home. His ex-wife's voice, angry and hurt, demanding to know why he always ran. Marcus's voice over and over. Why did you leave me, Chris? Why did you let me die alone? And underneath it all, the sound that wasn't quite language. A rustling, creaking, growing sound. The sound of trees moving, of roots extending, of something vast and patient shifting its attention fully onto him. Chris burst into another clearing and stopped. He'd been here before. The massive cedar tree, the hollow trunk. And sitting against it, wrapped in his thermal blanket, was Lauren Mitchell. The real one, still breathing, still alive, still staring at nothing with dilated pupils. This isn't possible, Chris gasped. I was just here. I ran for 15 minutes. I couldn't have. You can't run from inside something, Lauren said without moving her lips. The forest moves around you, the paths change. Distance becomes meaningless. He decides where you go, where you end up, always back to where you started, always back to the feeding place. Chris's radio crackled, his own voice. Sarah, I found something in the hollow tree. God, Sarah, there are so many of them, so many bodies. Chris? What are you? Chris, your signal is breaking up. Say again? They're stacked inside the trunk. Dozens, maybe hundreds. All preserved. All still looking at me. Sarah, I don't think... The transmission cut to static. Chris looked at the radio in his hand, watched as his fingers, his own fingers, following commands his brain never gave, turned it off. Removed the battery. Dropped both in the moss. No, he whispered. No, 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 no. His hands moved to his pack, unbuckled it, let it fall. Removed his jacket, his shirt, his boots. Each action smooth and automatic while his consciousness screamed from inside his own skull, trapped in a body that no longer answered to him. He's tasted your voice for so long, Lauren said. Her hand reached out, his hand reaching with it, mirroring the motion. He knows every frequency, every pattern, every choice you'd make. You're already his, Chris. You've been his since Marcus. This is just formality, just the body catching up to what the mind already accepted. Chris's legs moved him forward, step by step, toward the hollow tree, toward the dark inside it, where he could now see shapes. Bodies, preserved in moss and amber sap. Faces pressed against the inner bark. Marcus was there, wedged in the center, hands frozen reaching outward. A woman Chris recognized from a 2008 missing person case. A man from 2003. Going back, and back, and back. Dozens of them. Faces from posters, from files, from whispered rumors about the people who went into Olympic National Park and never came out. You'll be together, Lauren whispered. You and Marcus. That's what you wanted, isn't it? To understand what happened to him. To not be alone with the guilt. He's giving you that. He's generous that way. Chris's mouth opened. Words came out that he didn't choose. Thank you. The tree's hollow seemed to breathe. The space inside expanded, making room. Moss reached out like fingers, like welcomes, like a mother's embrace. It was warm inside. Warmer than the cold October air. Warm and dark and full of whispers. Full of voices. Full of the lost ones. Talking to each other. To themselves. To the thing that wore them like masks. Chris felt his body step into the hollow. felt the moss close around his ankles, felt roots, thin as hair, begin to grow into his skin. It didn't hurt. That was the worst part. It felt natural. It felt like belonging, like coming home. From somewhere distant, he heard Sarah's voice on a radio that was no longer in his possession. All units, be advised. Ranger Christopher Anderson is overdue from Lauren Mitchell's search. Last known position, Mineral Creek Basin. Storm has reached the area. Search suspended until conditions improve. Then there was just the green, and the dark, and the patient, ancient thing that had been waiting for 5 years. That had called him back with Marcus's voice. That had used Lauren as bait. That was now adding his voice to the collection, his face to the bark, his consciousness to the chorus. In the hollow of the cedar tree, Christopher Anderson stood perfectly still, eyes open, staring at nothing. His lips moved occasionally, forming words that drifted through the forest on the wind. Words that sounded almost like his voice, almost like cries for help, almost like someone lost, calling for rescue. By the time the storm passed 3 days later, the search had been officially called off. 2 more lost in Olympic National Park. 2 more statistics. 2 more names added to the list of people who ventured into the green and never returned. The forest grew quiet again, patient, waiting, and in the spaces between the trees, voices called out to anyone who would listen. Familiar voices, loved voices, voices you'd trust, voices that said, "Come find me, I'm lost, please help, I'm so scared, I'm so alone." The forest always needed new voices, new faces, new names to call out in the dark. That was its nature. That was what it did. That was what it would always do. Thanks for reading. If you enjoyed this narrative, follow for more stories. What's your theory about Lauren's fate? Drop your thoughts. The Hoh rainforest still stands in Olympic National Park. It receives an average of 140 inches of rain per year. The old-growth cedars have stood for over 1,000 years, and sometimes, hikers report hearing voices in the distance. Calls for help that lead them deeper into the green. Voices that sound like people they know, people they trust. Park rangers advise against responding to such voices, against leaving established trails, against going into the forest alone. Most people listen. Some don't. The forest always welcomes them with open arms. The phone rang at 4:47 a.m., pulling Daniel from the same dream he'd had for 3 years. In it, Marcus was always reaching for him across the ravine, always falling, always silent. Daniel's hand shot out in the darkness of his cabin, knocking over the half-empty whiskey glass on the nightstand before finding his cell phone. Martinez speaking. "Mr. Martinez," the woman's voice cracked with exhaustion. "This is Helen Chen. They said you're the best tracker in Sequoia. My daughter Sophia, she's been missing since yesterday morning and, ma'am, I'm sorry." Daniel sat up, rubbing his face. The ranger uniform hanging on his chair seemed to watch him in the pre-dawn gloom. "I don't do search and rescue anymore. Let me transfer you to... Please." The word broke something in her voice. She's 8 years old. The other rangers, they've been looking. But it's been 36 hours now. They found her jacket near Congress Trail, but nothing else. Someone at the visitor center said you found people when no one else could. Before you stopped. Daniel closed his eyes. 36 hours in the giant forest this time of year meant exposure, dehydration, possibly hypothermia at elevation. It also meant something else, something he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. "I can't help you, Mrs. Chen. They said you stopped after your partner died." Her voice steadied, sharpened. "They said it wasn't your fault, but you blamed yourself anyway. Mr. Martinez, I don't care what happened to you. I care what's happening to my daughter, right now, while we're talking." Daniel looked at his hands. In the faint light from his phone screen, he could still see the scars on his palms from that day. The day he'd grabbed at roots and rocks as Marcus fell past him. The day the forest had taken someone he'd sworn to protect. "Where are you staying?" The Sequoia National Park headquarters buzzed with controlled chaos when Daniel arrived 40 minutes later. He hadn't worn his full uniform in 11 months, not since they'd finally stopped assigning him to search operations. The fabric felt foreign across his shoulders as he pushed through the door. Chief Ranger William Breckenridge looked up from a topographical map spread across the conference table. His weathered face registered surprise, then something harder to read. Martinez, heard you were coming. Where's the family? Lodgepole Campground, Cabin 12. I told Helen Chen you'd retired from SNR. I did. Daniel approached the map, forcing himself to look at the marked areas. Red circles indicated search zones already covered. Blue pins showed where Sophia's belongings had been found. Brief me. Breckenridge studied him for a long moment before pointing to a location on Congress Trail. Elevation 6,720 feet. 8-year-old female. Last seen by her parents here at 9:15 a.m. on November 3rd. Family was hiking the trail together. Girl wandered ahead around a bend. When parents caught up 30 seconds later, she was gone. We found her purple jacket here. He tapped a blue pin, about 200 yards off trail, heading northeast toward the backcountry. No other trace. Ground search pattern. Standard grid, expanding radius. We've covered a 5-mile zone with 3 teams. Used dogs for 12 hours yesterday until they lost the scent at Crescent Creek. Helicopter thermal imaging this morning showed nothing. Daniel traced the search perimeter with his finger, feeling the familiar calculations running through his mind despite himself. A child Sophia's age could potentially cover 4 to 6 miles in 36 hours if uninjured, but the terrain northeast of Congress Trail was brutal. Steep inclines, dense undergrowth, deadfall that could trap or injure. The dogs losing the scent at the creek was wrong, though. Water could disrupt tracking, but Crescent Creek was shallow this time of year, barely ankle deep. What's the temperature been at night? Low 40s at base elevation, 30s up higher. She was wearing a fleece and jeans when she vanished. No survival gear. Hypothermia wasn't the immediate threat then, but it would be soon. Daniel's eyes drifted to the areas beyond the search perimeter, to the sections of backcountry few hikers ever saw. The old-growth forest where sequoias over 3,000 years old stood like sentinels, where the maps showed vague dotted lines marking historical indigenous sites without elaboration, where Marcus had died. I need the trail logs from the past month, Daniel said quietly. Any reports of unusual activity, missing persons cases, even minor incidents? Breckenridge's jaw tightened. Why? Because a kid doesn't vanish like that on Congress Trail. It's one of the most trafficked areas in the park. Multiple families around, sight lines that extend for hundreds of yards, and dogs don't lose scent at a shallow creek unless something disrupted it deliberately. You think this is foul play? We've been treating it as a lost hiker scenario. Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't explain the cold certainty settling into his chest. The same feeling he'd had 3 years ago when Marcus suggested they check the restricted zone near the senator tree. The sense that the forest itself was paying attention. Just get me the logs. 2 hours later, Daniel stood at the exact spot where Sophia had last been seen. His weathered Garmin GPS confirming the coordinates. 36.5831 degree N, 118.75 degree on W. The morning sun filtered through the massive sequoia canopy overhead, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow across the paved trail. Tourist families moved past him, children pointing up at the colossal trees, parents reading from trail guides. The normalcy felt obscene. He closed his eyes and listened. This was something he'd never been able to explain to other rangers. This ability to hear what the forest was saying beneath the obvious sounds. Most people heard wind in branches, bird calls, the rustle of small animals. Daniel heard the spaces between those sounds, the subtle wrongness when something was out of place. And right now the forest was lying to him. The birdsong was too uniform, too regular. The wind moved through the canopy with a pattern that felt rehearsed. Even the quality of light seemed artificial, staged. Daniel opened his eyes and looked northeast, toward the backcountry beyond the tourist trails. The forest in that direction appeared darker, denser, as if the shadows between the trees were somehow more substantial. He pulled out his radio. Martinez to base. Breckenridge's voice crackled back. Go ahead. I'm heading off trail, following the projected path from where the jacket was found. Probably be out of radio range within the hour. Negative, Martinez. Protocol requires you stay with... Daniel switched off the radio and pocketed it. Protocol was designed for normal searches, and nothing about this felt normal. He checked his pack. Water, first aid kit, emergency shelter, headlamp, flares. His old compass that had belonged to his grandfather. The compass that had somehow kept working even after the digital GPS had gone haywire that day with Marcus. The instant Daniel stepped off the paved trail, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. He'd experienced microclimates before. Cold pockets where elevation or shade created temperature differentials. But this was immediate and total, as if he'd passed through an invisible membrane into a different season. His breath misted in front of him. The tourist sounds behind him vanished completely, not fading gradually, but cutting off like someone had closed a door. Daniel forced himself to keep moving, to focus on the physical evidence. Sophia's jacket had been found about 400 yards in this direction, caught on a manzanita bush. The search teams had thoroughly worked this area, but Daniel approached it differently. He wasn't looking for where Sophia had gone. He was looking for why she'd gone there. The jacket hung on the bush exactly as described in the report, though it should have been removed as evidence. Daniel reached for it, then stopped. The purple fleece was pristine, no dirt or tears, no signs of having been dragged through undergrowth by a panicked 8-year-old. More importantly, it was positioned at exactly eye level for an adult, hanging on the bush as if placed there deliberately, as if it was meant to be found, as bait. A sound reached him then, faint but distinct. A child's laughter, coming from deeper in the forest. Daniel's training warred with his instincts. The training said call it in, wait for backup, establish a perimeter. His instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive in the wilderness for 15 years, said that calling would mean whoever or whatever had taken Sophia would move her, would disappear entirely. His instincts also reminded him that the last time he'd trusted them this completely, Marcus had died. He moved toward the sound. The forest changed as he penetrated deeper into the backcountry. The sequoias here were older, more massive, their bark furrowed with centuries of growth. Some had fire scars dating back to before Europeans arrived in California. The undergrowth thinned, creating cathedral-like spaces beneath the ancient trees. Daniel's boots crunched on duff that might have been accumulating since the Middle Ages. The laughter came again, closer now. It sounded genuine, joyful even, completely at odds with a child lost and terrified in the wilderness for 36 hours. Daniel's hand dropped to the Glock 22 on his belt. Standard Ranger issue, something he'd barely touched since Marcus. The weight was both reassuring and horrifying. What was he planning to shoot? A lost little girl? Or whatever he suspected might have taken her? The trees opened into a small clearing, and Daniel stopped so abruptly he almost fell. In the center of the clearing stood a sequoia that dwarfed even the massive specimens around it. The trunk had to be 40 feet in diameter, the bark so deeply furrowed it created caves in the living wood. The branches started 200 feet up, spreading across half the clearing like the architecture of a cathedral. But it was what stood at the base of the tree that froze Daniel's blood. Sophia Chen sat cross-legged on the forest floor, apparently unharmed, arranging pine cones in elaborate patterns. She was humming to herself. Sophia? Daniel's voice came out hoarse. The girl looked up and her smile was radiant. Hi, are you here to see the trees too? Daniel approached slowly, his ranger training finally kicking in through the shock. Check for injuries, establish trust, extract the victim from danger. But Sophia showed no signs of distress, no hypothermia symptoms, no fear. Her clothes were clean. Her face was bright, almost unnaturally so. Sophia, I'm Daniel. I'm a park ranger. Your parents are very worried about you. Are you hurt? No, silly. I'm fine. The keeper brought me here to play. The cold that had nothing to do with temperature crawled up Daniel's spine. The keeper? He's very old. He says the trees used to talk to people, but most people forgot how to listen. He says I'm special because I can still hear them. She gestured to the massive sequoia behind her. This one is the oldest. She's been here for 3,412 years. She remembers when the first people came. Daniel knelt down slowly, maintaining eye contact, assessing. The girl's pupils were normal, her responses coherent if unsettling. She wasn't drugged. She wasn't injured. But she wasn't acting like someone who'd been lost and terrified either. Sophia, we need to get you back to your mom and dad. Can you walk? Of course I can walk, but I can't leave yet. The keeper needs to show me something first. She tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made Daniel's skin prickle. He says you've been here before. He says you left something behind. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. I don't know what you're talking about, Daniel said, though his hands were shaking now. Come on, let's go. He reached for Sophia's arm, and the world shifted. If this story is capturing your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in Daniel's situation? Share your thoughts. The clearing was suddenly different. Wrong. The sequoia behind Sophia flickered, its bark transforming from red-brown to silver-gray and back again in rhythmic pulses. The shadows between the surrounding trees deepened, took on texture and weight, became almost corporeal. And standing among those shadows was a figure that Daniel's mind struggled to process. It was tall, impossibly so, dressed in what might have been ceremonial robes or might have been bark and lichen grown into humanoid shape. The face, if it had a face, was obscured by a wooden mask carved with symbols Daniel didn't recognize. But he felt the attention behind that mask, the weight of awareness that predated everything he understood as civilization. You returned. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in Daniel's chest rather than his ears. 3 years ago, you violated the sacred boundary. You brought another, and the trees demanded payment. Marcus. Oh God, Marcus. I didn't know, Daniel heard himself say. We were searching for a lost hiker. We were doing our job. There was no lost hiker. The figure moved closer without seeming to walk, reality bending around it. There was a warning. The trees called, and you came. But your companion carried poison in his heart. Greed, the disease of those who see the forest as lumber, as profit. The trees judged him, and the earth opened to receive him. Daniel's mind reeled. The search 3 years ago, the hiker who'd been reported missing in the restricted zone but was later found safe in a different park entirely. The way Marcus had insisted they check the area anyway had seemed almost compelled to descend into that ravine. The moment the ground gave way beneath him, so sudden and complete it was, as if the earth itself had simply decided to swallow him whole. You're lying, Daniel said, though his voice lacked conviction. Marcus was a good ranger. He protected the forest. He protected the appearance of the forest. He spoke of conservation while dreaming of the retirement fund he would build by accepting bribes from logging companies. The trees see what the heart hides. The figure gestured toward Sophia, who sat watching with the same unsettling calm. This child's heart is pure. She sees the trees as they truly are, ancient, aware, eternal. She is welcome here. But you... The mask tilted, studying Daniel. You carry guilt that is not yours to bear. You punish yourself for a judgment that was not your doing. The trees ask, why do you resist their truth? Daniel's mind fractured. The rational part, the part trained in wilderness medicine and search protocols and GPS coordinates, screamed that this was impossible, that he was hallucinating from hypothermia or a head injury he didn't remember receiving. But another part, deeper and older, recognized what stood before him as something his grandmother had told him stories about when he was Sophia's age. The guardians of sacred places, the spirits that predated maps and property lines, and the very concept of national parks. I don't believe in you, Daniel said, hating how his voice shook. Belief is not required. The figure raised one hand, and Daniel saw it was actually a branch, gnarled and ancient. growing directly from the arm of the robe or body or whatever this thing was. You will remember now. Remember the truth you fled. The forest exploded into memory. Daniel was back in the ravine 3 years ago watching Marcus fall. But this time, he saw what his traumatized mind had edited out. The roots that reached up from the ravine walls, moving with purpose, with intention, the way they'd caught Marcus not to save him but to drag him down faster. The moment his partner's eyes had met Daniel's, filled not with fear, but with a terrible understanding, an acceptance of judgment rendered. And Marcus's final words, which Daniel had convinced himself he'd imagined, "They know." Daniel gasped, back in the present clearing, his knees hitting the forest floor. The figure stood over him, not threatening but waiting, patient as a tree. You were spared because your heart held doubt but not corruption. You questioned but did not betray. The trees released you with a warning: do not return to the sacred boundary. The mask seemed to focus on him with renewed intensity. Yet here you are. Why? The girl, Daniel managed. I came for the girl. She was never lost. She was called. The trees wished to test her, to see if humanity had produced any worthy of remembering the old ways. The figure gestured, and Sophia stood still smiling. She has passed the test. She will return to her parents unchanged, but she will carry the memory. When she grows, she will speak for the trees in the world of men. And me? Daniel asked. You have a choice. The figure moved closer and Daniel could smell loam and ancient wood, rain and stone. Accept what you witnessed. Understand that Marcus was judged by laws older than your rangers, older than your nation, older than the memory of empires. Carry this knowledge and honor the boundary. Or the forest around them darkened. Or deny it again. Force your mind to construct a rational explanation for what stands before you. Return to your life of guilt and whiskey and nightmares. But know that the next time someone crosses the boundary, the next time the trees must defend themselves, you will not be spared. You will be judged not for your heart, but for your silence. Daniel looked at Sophia, at her calm certainty, her acceptance of impossibilities. He thought of Marcus, of 3 years spent trying to drink away the truth his eyes had shown him. He thought of the forest he'd devoted his life to protecting and the horrible understanding that it had never needed his protection. It had always been the one doing the protecting by methods he'd refused to acknowledge. I understand, he said quietly. I'll honor the boundary. The figure nodded and reality stabilized. The shadows retreated. The massive sequoia behind Sophia became just a tree again, ancient and magnificent but no longer pulsing with otherworldly awareness. The figure itself faded, or perhaps had never been there in the way Daniel's rational mind understood presence, but the clearing remained changed. Or perhaps Daniel was the one who had changed. Sophia walked over and took his hand. It's okay, she said with the gentle authority of someone who'd seen beyond the veil. The keeper says you're one of the good ones. You just forgot for a while. Daniel stood on shaking legs. Let's get you home. They emerged from the forest 2 hours later, back on Congress Trail, and the world snapped back to its normal rhythms. Immediately, rangers swarmed them, radios crackling, voices overlapping in relief and excitement. Helen and David Chen ran screaming toward their daughter, tears streaming down their faces as they swept Sophia into their arms. She's unharmed, Daniel reported to Chief Breckenridge. No signs of exposure or injury. Found her about 2 miles northeast of the jacket location, playing in a clearing. Appears to have been sheltered somehow. Sheltered? Breckenridge's eyes narrowed. By what? Daniel met his gaze steadily. A fallen log formation created a natural shelter. She had access to a small stream. She was extremely lucky. It was the explanation that would go in the report, the story that made sense in the world of incident documentation and search and rescue statistics. Breckenridge studied him for a long moment, and Daniel saw something flicker in the chief's expression. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition of a lie told for necessary reasons. Get yourself checked by the medics. Breckenridge finally said. Then go home. You look like hell. As Daniel walked toward the parking area, Helen Chen caught up with him. Mr. Martinez, wait. He turned. She was still crying, clutching Sophia against her side, but her eyes were clear and focused on him. Thank you. Thank you for finding her. The other rangers said they said no one else could have. She paused, seeming to struggle with something. Sophia keeps saying strange things, about trees talking, about a keeper. The doctors say it's just stress from being lost, that children process trauma through fantasy. That's probably right, Daniel said carefully. Helen's grip on her daughter tightened. She also said the keeper told her to give you a message. She said to tell you, the debt is paid. The boundary stands. Honor it. Does that mean something to you? Daniel looked at Sophia. The girl gazed back at him with eyes that seemed far older than 8 years. And she smiled. A secret, knowing smile that said she understood exactly what she was. It means she's going to be fine, Daniel told Helen. Better than fine. Just, when she talks about the trees, about the forest being alive and aware, listen to her. Don't dismiss it as fantasy. Helen Chen studied him with a mother's intuition that something more had happened in those woods than what the official report would say. But she also saw something in Daniel's face that made her simply nod. I will. Thank you. Daniel sat in his cabin that night, his uniform hung back on the chair, a glass of water instead of whiskey in his hand. Through the window, he could see the dark line of the forest against the stars. Somewhere out there, in the deep places where the old sequoias stood, the boundary held. The sacred places remained guarded. And Marcus had been judged by laws Daniel was only beginning to understand. He pulled out his phone and opened a blank document. For 3 years, he'd been unable to write his official statement about Marcus's death, had gotten by with interim reports and verbal summaries. Now finally, he knew what to write. Ranger Marcus DeSoto died in service to the forest he swore to protect. His death occurred in a restricted area he accessed in violation of protocol. The forest determined he was in violation of boundaries that predate our authority and always will. No further investigation is required. The case is closed. He stared at the words for a long moment, then deleted them. That truth was too large, too dangerous for official records. Instead, he typed the version that people could accept. Ranger Marcus DeSoto died in a terrain fall while conducting an unauthorized search. Recovery of the body was not possible due to geological instability. Case closed. It was a lie that protected a truth. Daniel saved the file and closed his laptop. Outside, the wind moved through the sequoias with a sound that might have been approval, or might have been just wind. Daniel found he no longer needed to know the difference. He would honor the boundary. He would serve the forest with new understanding, and when tourists asked him about the giant sequoias, about their age and their majesty and their endurance, he would tell them the facts written in the guidebooks. But he would also watch for the children like Sophia, the ones who looked at the ancient trees and saw more than wood and bark and chlorophyll. Those were the ones who would carry the memory forward, who would keep the boundaries sacred when his generation was gone. The debt was paid. The boundary stood, and Daniel Martinez, for the first time in 3 years, slept without dreaming of Marcus falling. He slept instead to the sound of trees breathing in the darkness, their roots running deep into earth, older than names, older than nations, older than the concept of forgiveness, but understanding it nevertheless. The forest had judged him worthy of truth, and that, Daniel understood now, was both gift and burden, one he would carry for whatever days remained to him in the shadow of the giant sequoias. Thank you for reading to the end. If you appreciated this narrative, consider following for more engaging stories. What's your interpretation of the Keeper's true nature, ancient guardian, or manifestation of Daniel's guilt? I'd love to read your theories in the comments. The Douglas firs rose like cathedral pillars through the morning fog, their bark dark with moisture, their canopy invisible somewhere in the gray-green murk above. Matthew Chen adjusted his field pack and checked his handheld GPS unit for the third time in 10 minutes, watching the weak satellite signal flicker in and out. 2 bars. Better than nothing. The device was state-of-the-art for 2007, though he knew once they descended deeper into the Ho River Valley, even that tenuous connection to the outside world would vanish entirely. Brandon should have been back by now, Matthew muttered, more to himself than to the silent forest. His partner had left their base camp at dawn, 3 hours ago, to check the wildlife cameras they'd positioned near what the Kino called the old places, a series of moss-covered cairns deep in the rainforest that predated European contact by centuries. Matthew had argued against placing equipment so close to what were obviously indigenous sacred sites, not out of any spiritual concern, but because it seemed unnecessarily provocative. Brandon, younger and more cavalier about such things, had insisted the cairns were just piles of rocks, and the best black bear activity happened in that sector. Matthew was a biologist, not an anthropologist. He dealt in observable, measurable phenomena, scat analysis, tracking patterns, population dynamics. The Olympic Peninsula's isolated ecosystem fascinated him precisely because it could be understood through data, through science. The Quinault Rangers' warnings about respecting the boundaries struck him as the usual mixture of cultural sensitivity and tourist mysticism. Respect was one thing, he'd never disturb an archaeological site. But actual belief in forest spirits? That was Bronze Age thinking. Still, Brandon's absence gnawed at him. His partner was punctual to a fault, ex-military, the kind of person who radioed in every hour on the hour. The last transmission had come at 06:47, Brandon's voice crackling through static. Camera 12 looks good. Moving to check 13 and 14. The fog's thick as hell out here, but I've got good visibility to about 20 feet. Over. That was 2 hours and 43 minutes ago. Matthew pressed the radio transmit button. Brandon, this is base. What's your 20? Over. He released the button and listened to white noise punctuated by occasional pops of interference. He tried again. Brandon, do you copy? Over. Nothing. He told himself there were a dozen rational explanations. Dead battery. Brandon was always forgetting to charge the spare. Radio malfunction in the moisture. A fall, maybe a twisted ankle, forcing Brandon to focus on getting back rather than maintaining contact. Matthew had spent 15 years in the field. Equipment failed. People got hurt. The forest was dangerous enough without inventing supernatural threats. But something felt wrong. The quality of the silence, perhaps. Olympic National Park was never truly quiet. There should be birdsong, the rustle of small mammals, the distant sound of the Ho River. Instead, the fog seemed to muffle everything into a suffocating stillness. Even the drip of condensation from the fern sounded muted, as if the rainforest itself were holding its breath. Matthew made his decision. He'd follow Brandon's route to the cairn sites, 23 minutes according to his GPS track. He packed his emergency kit, first aid space blanket, water purification tablets, and slung his digital camera around his neck. The camera was his security blanket, his tool for imposing order on chaos. Whatever he found, he'd document it, evidence, data, reality. The trail Brandon had taken wasn't really a trail at all, just a game path winding between massive Sitka spruce and western hemlock. The fog grew thicker as Matthew descended into the valley, reducing visibility to a claustrophobic tunnel of gray. Moss hung from branches like rotting curtains. Nurse logs decomposed into the forest floor, their wood so saturated it squelched under his boots. Everything smelled of decay and growth happening simultaneously, that peculiar Pacific Northwest odor of life feeding on death. Matthew's rational mind cataloged details. Roosevelt elk droppings, relatively fresh. Scratches on a tree trunk, probably black bear. A Douglas squirrel chattering somewhere in the canopy, at least one normal sound. But underneath the scientific observations ran a current of unease he couldn't quite suppress. The fog moved strangely here, not drifting but seeming to pulse, almost to breathe. He checked his GPS. 15 minutes to the cairn sites. The signal had dropped to one flickering bar. That's when he saw the first marker. Brandon's orange surveyor's tape, tied around a young cedar about chest high. They used these to mark their route in areas where the GPS became unreliable. Matthew felt a surge of relief. He was on the right path. But as he moved closer, he noticed something odd about the tape. It was shredded, hanging in strips, as if something had clawed at it repeatedly. Not unusual necessarily. Elk sometimes rubbed against trees, and the tape could have caught on antlers. But the pattern was wrong. Too deliberate, too aggressive. Matthew photographed it, the camera's digital shutter making a tiny mechanical sound that seemed obscenely loud in the muffled forest. Through the viewfinder, he noticed something else. Scratches on the cedar bark, deep gouges that wept fresh sap. 4 parallel lines, each about an inch apart. Bear claws could do that certainly, but these marks were wrong somehow. Too regular, too purposeful, and they were fresh. The sap hadn't even started to oxidize. He moved forward, faster now, the unease blooming into something closer to genuine concern. 2 minutes later, he found Brandon's radio. It lay in the middle of the path, or what passed for a path in this trackless maze of ferns and fallen timber. The radio was intact, but the casing was scratched, and more disturbingly, it was warm to the touch, as if Brandon had just set it down. Matthew pressed the transmit button experimentally. Static. Then a strange sound underneath the white noise, something that might have been breathing or wind through trees, or perhaps just his imagination supplying meaning to random noise. "Brandon!" Matthew shouted, abandoning protocol. His voice disappeared into the fog as if the forest had swallowed it. "Brandon, where are you?" No answer, but something moved in the fog ahead. A shadow that might have been man-sized there and gone so quickly Matthew couldn't be sure he'd seen anything at all. He broke into a jog, ducking under low-hanging branches, his pack bouncing against his spine. The GPS beeped a warning, signal lost. He was navigating by memory now, and by the occasional flash of orange tape that marked their route. Except the tape was getting progressively more destroyed, some pieces hanging by threads, others torn completely away and lying on the forest floor like abandoned prayer flags. The cairns appeared suddenly, emerging from the fog like ancient sentinels. Matthew had seen them once before, when he and Brandon had initially scouted this area. 7 stone structures, each about 4 feet tall, built from river rocks stacked with obvious care and intention. The Quinault Rangers had been vague about their purpose. Burial markers, territorial boundaries, ritual sites, no one was entirely certain. What was certain was that they were old, pre-contact old, and that the Quinault considered them deeply sacred. "Don't touch them," the ranger had said. "Don't even get too close. That area belongs to the Tsiatko." "What's a Tsiatko?" Brandon had asked. The ranger had looked uncomfortable. "Old word. Old idea. Better to just respect the boundaries." Matthew had filed it under cultural mysticism and forgotten about it. Now, standing in the fog with the cairns looming like gravestones, he wished he'd pressed for details. Brandon's backpack lay at the base of the largest cairn. Matthew's stomach dropped. The pack was open, contents spilled across the moss and ferns, granola bar wrappers, a water bottle, Brandon's field notebook. But no Brandon. And more disturbing, the pack looked like it had been torn open, the heavy-duty nylon ripped as if by tremendous force. Brandon was paranoid about securing his gear. He'd never leave it like this voluntarily. Matthew knelt and picked up the field notebook, hands shaking slightly. The pages were damp but legible. Brandon's last entry was dated today, 06:52, 5 minutes after his final radio transmission. Camera 14 operational. Something weird about this place. The cairns looked different than before. Did someone rearrange them? Could swear the positions have changed. Fog is disorienting. Keep feeling like I'm being watched. Probably just elk. Need to. The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen trailing off in a jagged line across the page. Matthew's scientific training screamed at him to think rationally. Brandon had been spooked, maybe startled by wildlife, dropped his pack, and ran. Except Brandon didn't spook. And he certainly didn't run from elk or bears. More importantly, where was he? "Brandon!" Matthew's voice cracked. "This isn't funny. We need to get back to base camp." The fog seemed to thicken in response, pressing closer. And then Matthew heard it. A sound that froze him in place. Singing. Or something like singing. A voice, definitely human or human-like, but the melody was all wrong. The intervals too wide. The rhythm syncopated in a way that made his teeth ache. The words, if they were words, sounded like Coast Salish. The indigenous language of the region, but choked and distorted, as if the singer's throat wasn't quite shaped correctly for human speech. The sound came from deeper in the forest, past the cairns, where the fog became almost solid. Every instinct Matthew possessed told him to run back to camp, to call for help. Except his radio didn't work here and his GPS was useless. Brandon was somewhere in that fog and Matthew was the only person who knew something was wrong. The nearest ranger station was a 4-hour hike. By the time he returned with help, it might be too late. He forced himself to think like a scientist. Observe, document, form hypotheses. The singing could be another researcher, unlikely but possible. It could be a Kino spiritual practitioner, would explain the language. It could be Brandon himself, injured and delirious. That last thought propelled Matthew forward. He raised his camera and snapped photos as he moved past the cairns, into territory they hadn't mapped. The flash illuminated brief snapshots of reality. A fallen cedar spanning a ravine like a bridge, its underside carved with symbols he didn't recognize. A grove of alders growing in a perfect circle, their trunks twisted in spirals. More cairns, smaller ones, arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate design. The singing grew louder, and Matthew could now discern words or fragments of words. Kawati, Tsiatko, Sisiutl. Over and over, like a chant or prayer. The voice sounded wet, as if the speaker's mouth were full of liquid. Then the smell hit him. It was the stench of decomposition, but wrong. Too green, too organic, like rotting vegetation mixed with spoiled meat and something else. Something sharp and mineral that burned his nostrils. Matthew gagged, pulling his shirt over his nose and mouth. The smell was coming from ahead, from the direction of the singing. He should turn back. Every rational fiber of his being screamed at him to retreat. But Brandon was out here, and Matthew couldn't abandon his partner based on strange smells and eerie singing. There had to be an explanation. There was always an explanation. The fog parted suddenly, and Matthew stumbled into a clearing he was certain hadn't existed when they'd scouted this area 3 weeks ago. The space was roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet across, the ground covered in a thick carpet of moss that glowed faintly bioluminescent in the dim light filtering through the canopy. At the center stood a structure. Calling it a cairn would be inadequate. It was a tower of stones and bones, rising at least 8 feet high, topped with a skull that definitely wasn't human. Too elongated, the jaw too massive, eye sockets too wide set. Elk skull maybe, but proportioned all wrong. And sitting at the base of the tower, facing away from Matthew, was a figure. "Brandon?" Matthew's voice came out as a whisper. The figure didn't turn, but the singing stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Matthew could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Could hear the wet sound of the figure's breathing. Could hear something else. A faint hissing, like steam escaping from a kettle. The figure stood slowly, joints cracking audibly, and began to turn. Matthew raised his camera instinctively, finger on the shutter button, his scientist's brain still trying to document, to understand. The flash fired just as the figure completed its rotation, and in that instant of harsh white light, Matthew saw. It wasn't Brandon. It wasn't human. The thing standing in the clearing stood roughly man-height, but its proportions were grotesquely wrong. Arms too long, reaching nearly to its knees. Legs bent backward at the knee like a dog's hind legs. The torso was emaciated, ribs visible through mottled green-gray skin that seemed to be more fungus than flesh, crawling with patches of moss and lichen. But the face, God, the face. It had Brandon's eyes, not eyes like Brandon's. Brandon's actual eyes, blue-gray and terrified, set into a skull covered in bark-like skin, the mouth too wide, filled with teeth that looked like shards of obsidian. Those eyes locked onto Matthew with desperate, pleading recognition, and the mouth opened, and Brandon's voice came out, distorted but unmistakable. "Run!" Matthew ran. He crashed through the underbrush without thinking, without planning, pure animal panic overriding 15 years of field experience. Behind him he heard sounds. The crack of branches. A howl that started almost human and descended into something that couldn't be human. And underneath it all, that wet, wrong singing starting up again. His camera bounced against his chest, still recording in burst mode, flash firing automatically as he ran. Each brief illumination revealed nightmarish snapshots. The forest changing around him, trees that hadn't been there before, paths that curved impossibly back on themselves, and shadows, dozens of shadows, man-shaped but wrong, keeping pace with him just beyond the edge of the fog. Matthew's rational mind was screaming denials, hallucination, oxygen deprivation, poisonous spores in the air, anything but what his eyes were telling him. But that thing had Brandon's eyes. Brandon's voice. Brandon was still conscious inside that. The word came to him unbidden, dredged up from his conversation with the Quinault Ranger. Tsiatko. Wild man. Forest demon. The thing that took people who violated sacred boundaries and transformed them, twisted them, made them into something between human and forest, neither alive nor dead in any way that mattered. Mythology. Superstition. Not real. Except he'd seen it. Photographed it. And it had Brandon's eyes. Matthew's foot caught on a root and he went down hard, the camera flying from his neck, landing in the moss with a sickening crack. He scrambled for it, fingers closing around the plastic casing. Cracked screen but still functioning. And that's when he saw what his panicked flight had brought him to. Another clearing larger than the first, and this one was populated. 7 figures stood in a circle around a central fire that burned without smoke. Flames and unnatural blue-green that cast dancing shadows across their faces. No, not faces. Masks. Elaborate wooden masks carved with fanged mouths and hollow eyes, painted in red and black, the traditional colors of Coast Salish ceremonial art. The figures wore cedar bark cloaks and held staffs carved with symbols that seemed to writhe in the firelight. For a moment, Matthew felt a surge of hope. A ceremony. Real people. Help. Then one of the masked figures turned to look at him, and Matthew saw what was under the mask, or rather, what wasn't. The mask wasn't resting on a face. It was growing from the wood of the staff, which was growing from the ground, which meant the figure wasn't a person at all but something that had taken the shape of a person, a mockery of human form made from forest matter. And behind the mask was just more forest, moss and bark and crawling things. All 7 figures turned to look at him simultaneously, and the singing started again, coming from all of them at once. And Matthew understood with sudden, horrible clarity that this wasn't a ceremony he'd stumbled upon. It was a trap, and he'd walked right into it. The masked figures began to move toward him, not walking but gliding, their feet not quite touching the ground. Matthew stumbled backward, raised his camera, still working on pure instinct, document the impossible, and fired off a burst of shots. The flash seemed to agitate them. The figures recoiled slightly, and Matthew realized the light hurt them somehow, or at least disturbed them. He ran again, this time deliberately using the camera flash as a weapon, firing it in all directions as he crashed through the undergrowth. Each burst of light revealed more horrors. Trees with faces trapped in their bark, screaming silently. Animals that were fused together, wrong combinations of species that couldn't exist. And everywhere those shadows, watching, waiting, hurting him. Hurting him where? The realization hit him like cold water. He was being guided. Every time he tried to change direction, the shadows blocked his path, forcing him back onto a specific route. They wanted him to go somewhere. The question was why. Matthew forced himself to stop running and think. He was a scientist, he solved problems. What did he know? 1. Something had taken Brandon and transformed him. 2. That something was connected to the cairns, to the sacred sites he and Brandon had disturbed by placing their cameras. 3. The entities, whatever they were, seemed tied to this specific area of the forest. 4. Light affected them. But most importantly, Brandon had told him to run, which meant some part of Brandon was still in there, still human enough to warn him. If Brandon could be taken, could be transformed, could it be reversed? The rational part of Matthew's brain rejected the question as insane. You couldn't reverse mythology. These things didn't exist except they did. He'd seen them, photographed them, and if they existed, if they followed rules, however alien those rules might be, then maybe, just maybe, they could be understood, negotiated with, or stopped. Matthew pulled Brandon's field notebook from his pocket, flipping through pages with shaking hands. There, Brandon had made sketches of the cairn arrangements, noting how they'd changed position. Not random changes, deliberate rearrangement into new patterns. And underneath, in Brandon's meticulous handwriting, Ranger mentioned Kino traditions. Cairns mark boundaries. Moving them, crossing boundaries, permission to enter. They'd moved the cairns. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but they'd disturbed them while setting up camera equipment. They'd crossed a boundary they didn't know existed. And now the forest wanted payment. The shadows were closing in again, the singing growing louder, and Matthew could see more figures emerging from the fog. Some wearing those terrible masks, others in states of transformation like Brandon, caught between human and something else. How many people had violated this boundary over the years? How many hikers, researchers, tourists who didn't know the rules? Matthew's back hit something solid, a tree, massive and ancient, its bark carved with symbols that looked freshly cut despite the obvious age of the tree. The carving seemed to pulse in rhythm with the singing, and Matthew realized he was looking at a map of sorts, or perhaps a warning. The symbols showed figures approaching cairns, crossing boundaries, and then changing, transforming, becoming part of the forest. But there was another sequence of symbols. Figures approaching, leaving something behind. Offerings, perhaps. And then leaving unchanged. A transaction, an exchange. The forest didn't want trespassers. It wanted respect, acknowledgement, payment for the boundary crossed. Matthew's hands moved to his pack, pulling out everything of value he carried. His GPS unit, expensive and useless here. His emergency beacon, his digital camera, cracked but still holding dozens of images he'd never have the chance to study. He placed them at the base of the carved tree, and then, because it seemed important, he knelt. I didn't know, he said to the forest, to the shadows, to whatever ancient consciousness governed this place. We didn't know the rules. We didn't mean to disrespect. The singing stopped. The silence was absolute and terrifying. The masked figures stood frozen in a circle around him, and the shadows drew closer, close enough that Matthew could see they weren't shadows at all but gaps in reality. Spaces where the forest simply wasn't, replaced by something else. Something that predated forests, predated trees, predated anything human beings had words for. Then, from the fog, Brandon walked. Not the twisted thing Matthew had seen before, but Brandon himself, recognizably human. Though his skin had a faint greenish cast, and his movements were slightly too fluid, too graceful. His eyes were still his own, but they held knowledge no human should possess, ancient and terrible and sad. You need to leave, Brandon said, his voice his own but with harmonics underneath, as if multiple voices spoke in unison. Right now, follow the river. Don't look back. Don't come back. Ever. Brandon, I'm not Brandon anymore. The sad smile didn't reach those ancient eyes. Or I'm not just Brandon. I'm paying the debt. We took from this place. Now I give back. But you offered without being asked. The Tsiatko respects that. You get one chance. One. The masked figures parted, creating a clear path through the fog. In the distance, barely audible, Matthew could hear the sound of running water. The Ho River, What about you? Matthew's voice cracked. I'm staying. I'm becoming. It's not death. It's not really life. It's something else. Something that was here before your kind named the forests, before you built cities, before you forgot the old laws. Go, Matthew, while you still can. Matthew wanted to argue, wanted to find a scientific explanation, wanted to rescue his partner. But Brandon, or the thing Brandon was becoming, was right. This was his only chance. He grabbed his broken camera from the pile of offerings, some instinct telling him he'd need evidence, proof he wasn't insane, and ran toward the sound of water. Behind him, the singing started again, but different now, almost peaceful, almost welcoming. He didn't look back. The fog thinned as he ran, the forest gradually returning to normal. Actual birds singing, actual sunlight filtering through the canopy. The sound of the river grew louder, and then suddenly he was stumbling onto the riverbank, onto a hiking trail with actual trail markers, onto normal, mundane reality. Matthew collapsed onto the gravel, gasping, and checked his camera. The screen was shattered, but the memory card was intact. Proof. Evidence. He had proof, except when he got back to base camp 3 hours later, when the Rangers mounted a search party for Brandon. When he tried to download the photos to show them what he'd seen, the images wouldn't open. File corrupted, every single one. The only intact image was the last one, the photo he'd taken as he fled the clearing. It showed fog. Just fog. Nothing else. The official report listed Brandon Whitmore as missing, presumed lost to the wilderness. Matthew tried to tell them the truth, tried to explain about the cairns and the Tsiatko and the transformation. They listened politely, attributed his story to trauma and hypothermia, and suggested counseling. Matthew never went back to Olympic National Park. He left biology entirely, actually took a job teaching high school science in suburban Portland. Safe, urban, far from old forests and older rules. But sometimes late at night he dreams of Brandon's eyes in that alien face, and he hears the singing, that wet, wrong melody that's been echoing through the Pacific Northwest forests since before human beings learned to speak. And he wonders how many others have crossed boundaries they didn't know existed, how many more are out there, caught between human and forest, paying debts they didn't know they owed. The Quinault Rangers updated their orientation materials after Brandon's disappearance. Now they're explicit. Do not approach the stone cairns in the old growth sectors. Do not disturb sacred sites. Respect the boundaries. Because the Tsiatko is patient, and the forest always collects its debts. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most?